New Deal democracy faced a different kind of test in the steel towns of the North. Company towns like Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, where the Jones and Laughlin Mill stretched for 4 miles along the Ohio River. In the midst of the Depression, with millions unemployed nationwide, J&L provided jobs for a town it had literally built and owned.
You work, you save, you worry, so what you can take your dough when you go, go, go. So keep repeating it's the berries, the strongest oak must fall. But leave my bitty, wabba-bidda, wow. Life is just a bowl of cherries, so live and laugh at it all.
The main industry in town, of course, was J&L. In fact, it was a company town. J&L built the town, laid the town out, and were responsible to see that everything in Aliquippa was conducted in a good, solid fashion for the benefit of the citizens of the town.
Aliquippa people used to pour in from all over the world. Immigrants from Italy, Serbians, Yugoslavians, Irish people, blacks from down south would come up, work in the steel mills. And the town was one of the busiest towns in western Pennsylvania.
The town itself was broken up, and you had a segregated place for blacks, a segregated place for Englishmen, for Italians. In other words, the whites were not all together. They were segregated among themselves because there were divisions there.
Those areas, no black person ever walked after dark. In fact, you had a hell of a time getting around there during the day. They arrested you, take you down to the police station, and if you didn't answer the right question, they might hit you a few times on the head. If you worked in J&L, they arrest you for loitering, and they take $10 out of your pay.
To work at J&L's Aliquippa Mill, people had to follow rules established by Tom Girdler, who in the 1920s had been superintendent and later president of the company. During Girdler's time, Aliquippa earned a reputation as a tough, anti-union town. He worked closely with the local Republican Party machine and police to establish what he called a benevolent dictatorship.
The company, Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation, operated a very strict policy of control, of thought control and of human activity control. And George Izowski was a specific case where he was committed to an insane asylum in western Pennsylvania because he was unionizing, attempting to unionize the steel workers.
They were the controlling power because they had the jobs. They had the say-so over everything. And there was nothing that people could do, you know, unless they really wanted to take a chance at losing their jobs.
But as long as you followed their rules, which was keep your mouth shut, don't talk against J&L, don't join any unions, you were in good shape.
In 1933, Roosevelt's National Recovery Act recognized the right of industrial workers to form unions. Union leaders began a campaign for higher wages, an 8-hour workday, and job security. But when organizers arrived in Aliquippa, J&L drove them out of town. In nearby Ambridge, 50 J&L guards joined a sheriff's posse financed by local steel companies. On October 5th, 1933, they confronted strikers at the Spang Chalfant Steelworks. One man was killed, 20 wounded. the NRA had failed to protect workers' rights to organize unions. More than a year later, in an effort to limit strike violence and protect labor, Congress passed the Wagner Act. Although it did not cover farm workers, it promoted collective bargaining in the industrial workplace and gave the National Labor Relations Board the power to stop unfair labor practices by employers.
When the Wagner Act was passed, this was a kind of renaissance for those of us who had undergone all of this medieval treatment in our workplaces. And we idolized President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We thought he was one of the greatest men ever born. And he renewed our lives, our inspiration, especially in our unions.
Many corporate leaders were outraged by the Wagner Act and President Roosevelt. In Aliquippa, J&L defied the new law. The legal struggle would go all the way to the Supreme Court. Tom Girdler, now head of Republic Steel, saw the Wagner Act as a threat to his relationship with his employees. Girdler had built Republic Steel into a profitable powerhouse. He wanted no government interference.
Father thought Franklin Roosevelt was a disaster. It was during the Roosevelt years that the adversarial relationship between the unions and the companies was promoted to the greatest extent by the unions and backed by the government.
You may say that
John L. Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers, saw the Wagner Act as an opportunity to organize all industrial workers, including the millions of factory workers and blacks and immigrants excluded by the American Federation of Labor. Lewis broke with the AFL and formed the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO.
the workers of this country want representation. They want organization. They want participation. They want protection. They want employment. And they're going to have those things through the leadership and the instrumentality of this new labor movement that you're forming.
John L. Lewis's main target was the steel industry, the citadel of anti-unionism.
Steel underlay the whole industrial American operation. At the time when we were a country of smokestack industry, we needed steel to make the automobiles. We needed steel for all the purposes of industry. If there was no steel, there was no industry. This was the heart of the matter.
In June 1936, Lewis formed the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, SWOC. The CIO pledged $500,000 to begin the battle with the steel companies. Lewis chose Phil Murray, vice president of the mine workers, to head SWOC. Murray broke with tradition by including blacks and communists on his organizing team.
There was a ferment that's hard to imagine. People ran out of cards. You know, you went out to organize, you didn't have to plead with people and convince them. They grabbed the cards. They were ready. They'd been long ready. This was the Depression. They wanted something done.
I never attended a union meeting before, and there was an outside guard. And this guard asked me where I was going. I said, "Is this a meeting of 1014? He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I'm a member. I'd like to go." He said, "You know the password?" I said, "What password? Never heard of a password." So he looked at me, and I guess he recognized I was sincere. He said, "Well, look, I'm going to give you the password. You're not to repeat it to anybody, whether they're members of the union or not. And you're not to write it on anything. You have to memorize it. I said, okay. And he whispered to me, expansion. I know it to this day, I know it.
In the 1936 presidential election, big business spent heavily to defeat Roosevelt and end the advance of unions. But labor fought back. Unlike the sharecroppers in the South, union members in the North had the vote. The CIO held hundreds of rallies for the president and registered thousands of new voters. Seeking their support, Roosevelt made labor's enemies his own.
That this concentration of economic power in all embracing corporations does not represent private enterprise as we Americans cherish it and propose to foster it. On the contrary, it represents private enterprise which has become a kind of private government and is a power unto itself, a regimentation of other people's money and other people's lives.
The Roosevelt administration did everything they could to further the interest of the working people. By the working people, I mean the union people, because there was more votes there than there were at any other place else, and I think it was primarily for that reason.
2 months after Roosevelt's landslide victory, John L. Lewis began secret negotiations with Myron Taylor, chairman of America's biggest steel corporation, U.S. Steel. Taylor had watched CIO sit-down strikers win union recognition after stopping production at General Motors. He did not want to risk a production shutdown at U.S. Steel.
The $5 billion steel industry booms. Another business follows as labor leaders sign an agreement with a great steel corporation.
This is the first time in the history of the industry that a subsidiary of the United States Steel Corporation effected a bargaining agreement with an independent trade union.
Well, my father and all the heads of the small steel companies, Little Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Weirton, were all utterly disgusted and dismayed that Myron Taylor would sign a contract with the CIO.
The smaller steel companies, known as Little Steel, vowed to stop the CIO. But in April 1937, Little Steel executives were stunned when the Supreme Court ruled against J&L and upheld the Wagner Act. Workers in Little Steel now demanded union contracts.
Throughout Little Steel, what they wanted simply was what Big Steel already had. The people who were making steel for U.S. Steel were getting certain kinds, shorter hours, higher wages, certain kinds of protections. I don't know what all was in their contract, but it was a contract that for the first time gave the workers there some kind of recognition and had a mechanism to discuss grievances, a mechanism to try to raise wages. None of that existed in Little Steel.
Encouraged by the victory in the Supreme Court, Aliquippa steelworkers exercised their rights by striking at J&L, where Tom Girdler's old anti-union system still prevailed. The company had been stockpiling munitions in anticipation of a violent strike.
The 37 strike came about only because we asked the company to recognize the CIO as the only representative of the workers, and the company turned us down. And we were well prepared. We had the truck on the side with weapons because the other side was all armed. They were legal, we weren't.
We were really frightened for this union, and we were down at the J&L tunnel, and here comes this little old mail car. Of course, we stopped, and we weren't letting anybody in there. So this guy insisted on going in there, and these people just grabbed that mail truck and upset it right down. And there was no mail in there. There was sandwiches in there. There was pop. There was stuff for them to eat and keep staying. Them little stoolies that was working for J&L got to stay in the mill as long as they wanted, as long as they could feed them. They didn't care. They were paying them to stay in there.
If you were in a house and somebody came along and stood at the front door with a gun and said, "You can't get out," you'd say somebody was invading your privacy, invading your rights. In effect, that's what the unions did. They blockaded the entrance to the plant so that the people who were in there, that stayed in there, couldn't get out, couldn't get food, couldn't get mail, couldn't get to home to see their family.
On the second day of the strike, Pennsylvania Governor George Earle asked to inspect the mill accompanied by strike leader Joe Timko. The message was clear. The governor would not tolerate a repeat of the shootings at Ambridge. That same day, Timko was called to J&L's Pittsburgh office.
And they gave us what we wanted. That was a right to vote for the union of our choice.
SWAC won the election supervised by the National Labor Relations Board and negotiated an agreement stronger than the one at U.S. Steel.
Oh, boy. Tell me about it. We were really, really happy. We had a parade. I'll tell you, that street was loaded with people going up the street, celebrating, hollering, and screaming. That was the best day of our life, I'll tell you.
SWAC and the steel workers believed they had finally brought democracy to Aliquippa, and it now seemed that all of Little Steel would fall. Tom Girdler saw events in Aliquippa as a direct threat to the rights of management. In May, he spent $50,000 on arms and ammunition for Republic Steel. Girdler also prepared for a propaganda war, purchasing more than 40,000 pamphlets, which branded John L. Lewis a communist.
Father's opinion of John L. Lewis was not the highest. In fact, he thought he was a louse. Father said that before he would sign a contract with John L. Lewis, he'd go back to raising apples in Indiana. Philip Murray was just as bad.
The Republic cannot and will not enter into a contract, oral or written, with an irresponsible party, and the CIO, as presently constituted, is utterly irresponsible. Therefore, any discussion of this subject is futile.
On May 26th, SWAC called a nationwide strike against Little Steel. The next day, Little Steel picked Tom Girdler to lead their anti-union fight. But workers believed that even Girdler could be defeated. In a show of confidence, SWAC called a Memorial Day rally in a field near Girdler's Republic Mill in South Chicago.
We came out there and it was a gorgeous day, absolutely a beautiful day. People came out there like a picnic. We're going to support the steel workers and we're going to enjoy a picnic day with our families. And it looked like God shone on that idea.
And at the end of whatever little party they had, someone said, "Look, let's go to the plant and set up a picket line." And they started walking towards the plant.
And people were talking and holding hands, and the children were being carried by their fathers on their shoulders, and everybody was singing and joyful and very optimistic, and a feeling that we're going to win this. We're really going to win it. As we came closer to the mill, the walking slowed a bit. Now, I wasn't way up in the front line, but I wasn't very far back either. And what was happening there is that the mill was completely surrounded by cordons of police.
The radical elements created picket lines out there and brought people that were not connected to the plant in on the picket line.
There was rumors around that it was a communist movement oriented. And in that march, the city police were in and protecting the property of the South Chicago plant.
One fellow that was out there at the time told me that he was in the line as an observer. But he said there was a picket he talked to that was carrying a sign that said, "Kill Tom Girdler." He said, I asked him, "Who's Tom Girdler?" He said, "I don't know. I just was handed this sign."
I could see a few objects through the air. I could see some things being thrown. Not much. It wasn't a lot of stuff. Maybe a couple of rocks. I don't know. You could see a couple of things thrown. And then suddenly, it was like the 4th of July. There was a dry, crackling kind of a noise. It took me a moment to figure out what it was, and I realized it was gunfire.
As the line was pushing back, I was knocked down. And then a whole number of people were piled up on top of me. And I could barely breathe. And when the shooting finally stopped, and the silence prevailed, I looked around, and I saw a battlefield.
I see myself walking around there with a gray felt hat and a press card in it, and with my characteristic jerky kind of motion. And I'm walking around and I'm seeing these people lying on the ground. I'm seeing people handling them like sacks of potatoes. There was some small effort by the strikers to try to do some first aid stuff. There were no ambulances that I remember initially. They were taking them into paddy wagons. It was clear that a whole number of these people had been shot in the back. They were trying to flee, and they were still being fired at.
It was unfortunate, unnecessary, and got completely out of hand. But to say that the company caused it is an entire fabrication, and I don't know who should shoulder the blame.
10 marchers were killed and 30 wounded. News film of the incident was suppressed and not shown in movie theaters. Across the country, newspapers reported the incident as a riot by strikers, inspired by communists. The gunfire at Republic Steel stopped SWAC's momentum. In little steel towns across America, thousands were fired. In July, defeated steelworkers began returning to the mills without a contract.
I couldn't believe it because we had been so victorious in auto against the most powerful adversary in the whole country, the symbol of entrenched wealth and power, and to have the steel workers suffer this kind of a bloody defeat and reprisal was sent shockwaves across the whole country. So it was a defeat, but it steeled us in our determination to persevere.
Try to sum that up, Senator.
In testimony before the La Follette Committee and other congressional investigations, Tom Girdler blamed the Memorial Day shootings on John L. Lewis and communist agitators. Girdler contended that there had been no valid reason for the strike.
Plants were running approximately full. The men were making the highest wages they ever made.
Were the complaints from the men?
Always, in all manufacturing businesses, Senator, in my knowledge, particularly in the steel business, in my knowledge of 35 years, there are always minor complaints. There were no basic complaints as to wages, hours, and working conditions. There were minor complaints.
When the suppressed news film was finally shown to the La Follette Committee, it offered proof that the Memorial Day incident was not a riot by strikers. The committee condemned Little Steel for violating the civil liberties of steelworkers. Later, the National Labor Relations Board ordered elections in the mills owned by Little Steel. SWAC won every election, including the one at Girdler's South Chicago mill.
The Steelworkers Organizing Committee, after the good old steel strike, enlarged its perspective to go into the political activity so that the sheriffs and the judges would be on our side.
We got our heads together and elected our friends into public office, you see. As a matter of fact, we would insist that every member of the union vote. We had carpoos, pick them up as they come off their jobs, take them to their polling place, let them vote. When they finish voting, take them home.
We had to take over the town. We had to take over the county. We had to put ourselves in a position where we elected the sheriffs so they wouldn't break up our picket lines. We had to put ourselves in a position that we could elect judges where they wouldn't serve injunctions against us to stop us from doing the things we had to do, and to force the company, if we had a strike, to give us what we thought was right.
For democracy to be understood and meaningful, it has to be a participatory democracy. You have to have a role in it yourself. Now, voting once every 4 years for a president in Washington or every 2 years for a congressman is very important. But it is equally, if not more important, to be able to participate in determining under what circumstances you will sweat it out every day in the shop for 8 or 10 hours and what you'll be paid for it, and when you're too old to work and too young to die, whether you'll have a little something to take care of you. That kind of participatory democracy is equally important because democracy has to stand on 2 feet. One is political, the other is economic.
In the years of the Great Depression, the federal government moved to guarantee freedom of speech, of assembly, of association for workers in the industrial North. For disenfranchised Americans in the South, it would be 2 decades before a new movement for civil rights would incorporate the spirit of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, renewing the fight for full citizenship for all Americans.